Thank you, Noha. And since time is limited, and I'm standing here between you and the much-needed coffee break, I will go straight to the point. But please, during question time, ask me why I didn't thank the organizers for inviting me, and I didn't congratulate ERF for the 20th anniversary. Getting to the point, effectively, I will avoid ideas that somehow have been discredited here, and we heard that they don't lead to change, and I will go straight to the facts. And what I'll say is that if you don't get the facts will get you. And this applies not only to despots and governments, but also to donors and to thinkers and researchers, as we said, and the lack of intellectual leadership, it was again heard in this panel. What I'll do is I will cover some methodological and definitional issues and say a few things on the big picture before I get to the youth. And when I get to the youth, I will say it was not too many youth. It was not too many unemployed youth. It was not the youth bulge. It was not skills mismatch. It was not bad education. All this is iconoclastic, and perhaps these claims are new to some. In fact, even in this conference, we heard that there has been low job creation in the Arab world leading to the Arab Spring. And even we heard that employment creation, its quote from one presentation, is a primary concern to policymakers in the region. If it was, we wouldn't have the Arab Spring. If the leaders care for employment creation, if the youth and adults found decent employment, and if they had their dignity to that, and they didn't get into these marginalized forms of activities, in wage inequality, in dropping share of the wage in GDP, we wouldn't have the revolts, I gather. But anyway, as a fact, the issue is that job creation has been extremely high, leading to the Arab Spring, and also I don't think the leaders have been sincere or effective, at least, in taking into account decent employment creation. And since I may run out of time, the punchline is it was not the youth, it was the adults that created and led the change. And in very simple terms, thinking as an economist, we have three things to take into account. Is it demand, is it supply, or is it the market or institutions? And in a lecture I gave to the Islamic Development Bank 3 years ago, actually, I said it at the time, and I stand by that, the binding constraint in the Arab world has been labor demand and social dialogue. It's not the labor supply, it's not the youth, it's not the people, it's not education. Labor demand means the structure of the economy, and I think everybody now understands that, what we say, chronic capitalism. Now, social dialogue, and I wrote the ILO UNDP report on the Arab Spring, means not trade unions. In fact, the word trade union does not appear there. In fact, it does not mean democracy. The word democracy is not in this report, although it's an ILO UNDP report. What it means is there has to be a mechanism whereby there should be voice and accountability. The citizens should express their concerns, and the government should listen to them and respond. And democracy is not the only way to do it. In Greece, we had a dictatorship that deprived us of our political rights. When the dictatorship fell, GDP, the debt to GDP ratio was 18%. Then we had democracy, and we got our political rights, and we lost our economic rights. Greece is the most bankrupt country in the world today, having all the Olympic records in unemployment. 30% youth unemployment, we have it for breakfast. It's 61 in Greece and 58% in Spain. So it's not just democracy. Okay, we can use it in a descriptive term, but the issue is how we can improve the interface between the citizens and the rulers. I'm coming late, and it's, although I reduced my presentation, what I heard, I will not repeat. If I knew what was said this morning, I would have reduced it by another half. But let me go quickly through what I have. The data I have come from the World Bank, from the IMF, from the World Economic Forum and the ILO, of course from ERF, and in fact NOHA's previous research that I have cited very liberally when it comes to voice accountability and similar measures over time, as I'm not a political scientist. We are all familiar with the MENA region, but what I want to clarify here is we have to be careful if we're talking about the MENA region or the Arab world. These are different things. For example, when we include Iran in the Middle East, Iran has 46 of the population. It's 46 share in the total population of the Middle East minus the GCC. So if you aggregate Iran with the Middle East, effectively you are describing Iran. If you put Egypt in Northern Africa as such, it's almost half. And nationals in Saudi Arabia account for 78% of the nationals in the GCC. So when I read in all these reports, we use population-weighted averages for the MENA region. Effectively, it's the average of Iran, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. So the issue becomes, do we want to use weighted or unweighted averages? I think the average Arab doesn't mean anything to me. What I'm trying to explain is country performance. So I should use country averages, which reminds me when I was in the States, and they will say, oh, in America we do it this way, and in Europe you do it this way. And Europe includes Sweden and Greece. So when we're talking about the Arab region, I think it's imperative, at minimum, to take country averages and then to be a little bit more careful sub-regions or types of countries that we have in mind. Coming to the youth bulge, does it matter that 55% of the population is under the age of 25? Do children matter for employability and employment? Of course, it's very important. It matters for education, early childhood development, women's health, fertility, and all these kind of things. But we have to take out the children of this impressionistic estimate of 55%, and you will see the difference that it makes. We are familiar with that, the lost decade. It was mentioned in this panel and throughout the time we're discussing. We reached the limits of the old social contract. 1981, oil prices collapsed. We came to the 1990s and we did all these reforms. And the underlying philosophy was economic reforms first, political later. And this, I think, where the situation snapped. You have to have both. And I think it comes from what we're discussing. And in fact, Ahmad, in a paper he published a couple of years ago, he said, was it good economics, bad politics? What it was. And I would say it was bad politics. I think we agree on that. But because you have bad politics, you have bad economics. What does this mean? The economics was good, yes. You need privatization. At the end, it was not privatization. It was denationalization when the proceeds went to the establishment elites, to the son of Mubarak, the wife of Ben Ali, I mean the brother-in-law of Assad, and so on. We went for pro-market reforms. Yes, pro-market, but it's a difference between markets and competitive markets. And we didn't have competitive markets. We went for economic growth that we admire. Yes, we had the Renaissance, but that economic growth was driven by bubbles. It was driven by the denationalization. It was driven by the PCFs, a term I heard here, politically correct firms. And it was driven by social protection that was privatized. Therefore, I mean, we had good outcomes with the policies. Inflation was tame. We have to acknowledge that. The reforms worked in many respects. Trade opened, subsidies were rolled back, the deficit went down, the debt went down. But this is what economists care for, and the IMF, or even the World Bank. But people did not care for that. And we'll see what this means. So this is the Renaissance. We hailed the Renaissance, and indeed, these rates of growth were phenomenal by historical standards, but in a globalizing world, what matters is how fast you move relative to the others. And the region was not moving very fast, and if you put in that we still have fast population growth, the per capita income has been quite low. Now, this is the employment output elasticities. We had some sessions on the human development sessions we have here in ERF, and they found it about 0.6, I think, in Tunisia and other countries. And here I have the kind of the Asian performance on the right, where you have elasticity of 0.3. Every 10% increase in output leads to a growth of employment of 3%. Look what's happening to the three sub-regions. I have the Middle East on the left there. I have the North Africa here and the GCC. Look at the values, double the values. In fact, we are talking about an employment output elasticity of 0.7. It's phenomenal. In Europe has been 0 for about 20 years. And you see, in no Arab country, the employment output elasticity has been lower than in Asia. So there has been a lot of job creation and unemployment has decreased. It's still high, but it has decreased. So the question is, why didn't it happen in 1990 when unemployment was higher and it happened in 2010? Now, another indicator here is more people have been employed, the employment rate has increased, and the wage share has collapsed in the Middle East and North Africa. This is globalization. Yes, the wage share in general declined in the last 20 years. The workers get less of the growth. It's the 99%. The 1% goes elsewhere. But look at the collapse that we had, almost by 30%. And I think it was mentioned by Professor Gouda that the wage share has declined in Egypt from whatever, 70 to 30. So you have more people coming in, more educated, more dynamic, more of them work, and where's the justice? What do they get back from it? This is the difference between the Human Development Index by UNDP and the per capita income of a country. And you only have, I mean, 2 countries or 3 that do better in human development than in terms of their per capita GDP. All the GCC are below. And we have Tunisia only in North Africa. And effectively, we have Jordan and Palestine doing a little bit better there. So that's how we came, I mean, to 2010. And this is an index of protests in North Africa from '96. What you see is that the protests were coming in waves and they were increasing over time and they were suppressed more and more and more. But every time they were suppressed, but they stayed at a higher level than before. And then we come to 2010 and that's when the explosion happened. And I want to finish this kind of general introduction with something that I have to admit is an accidental discovery and puts all the econometricians to shame, but I had no intention of getting to that, and it was purely accidental. I had data from the IMF and the World Bank, and I put them together, and it was a little bit like Alexander Fleming's penicillin. He didn't clean his desk, accidentally he discovered the penicillin. So what I did, this is the Voice and Accountability Index by the World Bank, the Kaufman Index and others, and this is the growth in GDP leading to 2011. What you see here is, of course, you want to be there, to have high growth, high economic growth, 10%, and to be most democratic than anybody else. That's where you want to be. But you have a kind of a Phillips curve here. You can't have both. I mean, you can see China there. The highest performer, have very little kind, or in terms of voice, if you want, and accountability. You have India, right in the middle there. And then look who are the most admired countries, the laggards in terms of economic development. Sweden, Finland, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Norway, Denmark. What democracy does not create kind of growth? Well, these countries had growth in the past. They have very high income. If they kept increasing in the same rate as before, they would reach the sky. We have regression towards the mean. So at some point, yes, when you reach a standard, you have high voice and accountability, and also you have decent kind, 1–2%, and these countries have 0 population growth. Now there is a quadrant there that does not show, that has, you don't want to be there. And if you count the red dots, they are exactly 22. And you guessed it, there are 22 Arab countries. And all the Arab countries are in the wrong quadrant there. You don't want to be there, and definitely you don't want to be to the left of that. Look who we have there. Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen. If you translate that into the R square, it's 85%. So this kind of very simple graph makes 5 correct predictions out of 6. Saudi Arabia is there and Bahrain is out. But you see at the end we have a story here that we have poor economics and poor politics and poor economics. So with this in mind, let's get into the youth issues. Horrible. The youth population has increased by 23 million since 1991, and unemployment rate did not go down. Why? I mean, we heard all these explanations here. High fertility, the youth bulge, bad quality education, training, employment protection. Yes, we had that too. It's a country, a region that has 80% of the employment is informal. Employment protection is binding. I mean, we can discuss that. And then you have the attitudes of the youth and the culture. Now, how could they miss the bulge? This is the fertility rate in the Arab world since 1950. It's the most predictable indicator, population projections, of all indicators you can do in social sciences. And look when it peaked, in 1965 to 70. The youth are 15 to 25, so from 85 to 90, the bulge must have been over, shouldn't be? It's so simple, it should have been done by then. And indeed, it was done by then. If instead of saying that 50% of the population is below the age of 25, you take those who are above the age of 15 and those who matter, because in the labor market what matters is the relative supply of the youth vis-à-vis the adults. This is the competition, who will get the job. And look what's happening here. Forget the GCC. The ratio of youth in the GCC declined because of immigration. North Africa never had a youth bulge since the 1980s. In the Middle East it peaked in 1990, and now it has been very, very, very low. So the youth bulge was never there in terms of pressure in the labor market, okay? That's the point we want to find here. Oh, too many youth and what you can do with that. Okay, it's them that it's responsible. Okay, too many youth unemployed? No, too many adults unemployed. In 1990, there were 130 unemployed youth for 100 adults. Today, in 2010, there were more adults unemployed. This is the ratio of youth to unemployed, youth unemployed to adults unemployed. So by 2010, the pressure was not from too many youth, too many unemployed. By 2010, we had too many unemployed adults. That was where the chronic capitalism hit. And that's why I think the revolutions had an impact, because the youth always, I mean, in the 1960s they were in the US with Vietnam, I mean, and Paris, 1970s in Greece and the like. If the youth could change the world, we would be living in a better world, I think, because they have an interest in long-term outcomes, while the adults do not. So, too many, the youth have the highest unemployment rate, granted, but the adults have the highest unemployment rate in the Arab region. Look at the adult unemployment rate here, 13%. Is higher than the youth unemployment rate in all other regions. Look at underemployment. It is the same as Africa only. So we're dealing with this systemic thing in the labor market, and in fact, what we've been saying, unemployment is a youth issue in the Arab world, is totally misleading. I will skip the gender slide, you can ask a question. But let's come back to this one. 23 million more unemployed youth. More youth in the population between 91 and 2010, okay? And the unemployment rate 26, 25. Now look what happened here. I mean, there were only 17% of youth in school in 91. Now it's the biggest single category. It increased by almost doubled. Every other thing went down. So there have been phenomenal changes, and the youth is much more educated. We're dealing with a much bigger middle class, but it was the labor demand that did not absorb, did not meet the aspirations and the skills of the youth. Why the unemployment rate was the same? Well, unemployed youth declined, but so did employed youth. So we have a good indicator here. There are more youth in school, fewer employed, and fewer unemployed, but measuring unemployment rate, a rate over rate, you get something that has no meaning for policy. I'm not saying it's not an important issue, but we have to diagnose it correctly. Now, I had something on education, which I'm humble talking in front of Ahmed, who did the Road Not Travel, and I blended it actually with another publication that came later, From Privilege to Competition, and from the World Development Report. I mean, we have two explanations here. Is it that the quality of education has been bad and we have mismatches? Or is it that there is no demand for this kind of skills that the young people bring to the market? And of course we know the Arab youth have the highest skilled immigration rate in the world. So they live from Lebanon, from Jordan, from Morocco, from Tunisia. They go to France, they find work. They go to Canada, they find work. They go to America, they find work. They go to Australia, they find work. So there is work for them everywhere except their own country. What's the problem? Their skills are not demanded in their own country. Back to the brain drain that Dr. Krom was saying. But let's look at the returns to schooling. 120 countries, a study just for this year. These are countries which are by region, South Africa, Asia, Pacific, or by different kinds, formalizing in conflict economies, small islands, high income, low income, and the like. Where is the Middle East here? There. Oh, the Arab world. It is just there. 10 more minutes, yeah. Where is the Middle East here? It is just last. There are no returns to education. It could be that they are not productive, the guys and the lasses in the Arab world, or the other thing could be that there is no demand for them. And in fact, the returns to education are 3.5% for secondary in the Arab world compared to an average of 7, and for tertiary is 8.9 compared half again. So you see, I mean, there are no returns there. But look at something now. Look, returns to primary education. Here, the Middle East is not, North Africa is not last. Why? Because that's the kind of skills that the market wants, unskilled laborers. We are dealing with low value, low productivity, labor demand, not subject to competition. We just can make use of any kind of labor. I will not go through this very much, only to say that according to the World Development Report, the change in productivity in the Middle East and North Africa was negative with respect to reallocation across sectors. In other words, jobs have been created in the last few years in the wrong sectors, say in agriculture. And indeed they have been created in agriculture, because here, if you take the level of income and job creation, all the Arab countries create more jobs in agriculture that would be predicted from their income. And in fact, if you take another case of Algeria, unemployment has decreased dramatically, but it was one-to-one increase in informality. So we're talking about employment creation in agriculture, informality, and guess what? Foreign workers. It's not in the GCC. I don't want to go to Lebanon and other countries. Take Jordan. Jordan had another renaissance and created 400,000 jobs in this period, and became the poster child, along with Egypt and Tunisia, of the Renaissance. Now, what was this growth? This growth was Israeli firms with domestic employers bringing workers from South Asia. And what happened? Look how much non-Jordanian employment increased compared to Jordanians. And then we come and we say, oh, the Jordanian youth are picky. They only want to work in the public sector. And it is this duality we have to drive. No. Let's make the private sector really competitive and serving the interests of the nationals. Now, in European Union, these are real data, and is the summary of globalization. In the last 10 years, the unskilled were reduced by 15%, the semi-skilled secondary education increased by 20%, and the educated workers by 50%. That's the labor supply, real data. In terms of labor demand, the middle has collapsed. We need a lot of unqualified workers and a high premium for education. I think that's what we have to trace. What happens there, not the labor supply. I think in the Arab world, the situation is this. We still want a lot with primary education, very high unemployment of people with secondary education, and there is no demand for high skills. Of course, this contrasts this table that shows that even Lebanon has very high shortages. That's what the employers say. And overall, the Arab world has skill shortages. The employers say 30% of them, we have skill shortages. Granted, is this the binding constraint? If you see it this way, you say, yes, it's the education system. But look at this one. Where does the skill constraint come in the concerns of Arab investors? This is the land that George Corum mentioned: informality, instability, cost of finance, tax rates, and so on. So, if there were demand for skills, what do? The firms train. In the Middle East, the firms do not train. They are quite contented with primary education and very basic technology. I'll skip this one, and I will say an area where indeed education will be useful is to educate the Arab managers, which fits what we were discussing yesterday about entry, exit rates, age of the firms, and so on. Now, finishing, let's just say something on the prospects. I fully agree with what the World Bank says, that in the next 15 years we'll need 600 million jobs. And I would say, since the Arab world is about 5% of the global population, 30 million jobs should be enough in the next 15 years, wouldn't be? I mean, unless I make a mistake. But now look at this. World Economic Forum 2012, I have omitted the people who said that. I can tell you who they are. I mean, in terms of description, they are professors, CEOs, consultants, reporters, and others. And what they say is we have a 100 million youth challenge. We need to create 80 million jobs in the next 80 years. You remember I said 30 before. Here, another 80 million, 100 million here. This is more nuanced. 80 million to absorb those at the current rate and 20 million to reduce unemployment. So we need to create 10 million jobs for the youth. This is public. This is in the public discourse. World Economic Forum. I did my calculations here, and forget the children. They are immaterial for the job market. This is how many the youth will grow up until 2030. These are the UN official projections. This is how much the working age population will increase, and this is how much the elderly, above 65. If you apply the current participation rates, there will be 6 million youth coming into the labor market more by 2030. So in 20 years, you need 6 million jobs for youth, not 100 million jobs till 2020. I mean, where can they get that? So what are the prospects? Well, not very great. This is from the IMF projection. This is the Middle East, includes the GCC. So yes, in the current oil prices, it will not be the last, but it can become easily the last. And how long will it take to reduce unemployment? This is the last slide. Well, the ILO has done this study, how long it takes to get back to the pre-crisis level. For countries that went back to the pre-crisis level, it takes 11 years. And many of them did not go back to the pre-crisis level, on average, after 17 years that they have been observed. So the prospects now are very kind of bleak for the youth, and we're talking about 20 years to get back to where we were in 2010, but at least let's measure it rightly. So all in all, the problem is with the economy and the adults. There is nothing wrong with the youth, and the adults control the economy and the youth. And let me thank you here with something that I read in no other place, no other Arab country, that in Saudi Arabia last month. Things may be moving there also. Thank you.